On June 22nd of 1941, the Germans betrayed their Soviet allies and attacked the USSR with 3 million troops. This was Operation Barbarossa, which remains the largest invasion ever undertaken in human history. Surprisingly, a sizable force of Italians, known as the Italian Expeditionary Force in Russia, were part of the invasion. At this time, the Italian military was known for incompetence, with Nazi Germany having to come to their aid multiple times. However, the Italian Expeditionary Force broke this stereotype and was an important asset during Operation Barbarossa. On today's episode of Bet You Didn't Know History, we are diving into the history of the Italian Expeditionary Force. In May 1941, Italy's fascist dictator, Benito Mussolini, began planning Italy's involvement in Operation Barbarossa. After the failed Italian invasions of Greece and other countries, each requiring German assistance, Mussolini wanted to prove Italy's worth as an ally. Mussolini also wanted the opportunity to combat communism, as this was central to his fascist ideology. The Italian Expeditionary Force in Russia, or in Italian, the Corpo di Spedizione Italiano in Russia, or CSIR for short, had a strength of around 62,000 men. The CSIR was composed of 3 divisions: the 3rd Cavalry Division, known as the Duca d'Aosta, the 9th Infantry Division, known as the Pasubio, and the 52nd Infantry Division, known as the Torino. While the Torino and Pasubio divisions were motorized, the 3rd Cavalry Division was a combination of traditional saber-wielding cavalry and motorized units, with much of the division's artillery being horse-drawn. Yes, the Italian army was not only using cavalry soldiers during the Second World War, but using cavalry soldiers armed with swords. Additionally, the CSIR had a limited aviation unit, with some bombers, fighters, and transport aircraft. The CSIR had its own commander, Giovanni Messi, but was subordinate to German control. The CSIR was sent to southern Russia, in what is now Ukraine, serving under the German 11th Army. The Italians were successful in the early days of the invasion, utilizing their vehicles to quickly advance into Soviet territory. The Germans were impressed and relied on the Italians as they were one of the few mechanized infantry companies in the sector. The CSIR's most notable early victory came at the Battle of Petrikokka. At the Battle of Petrikokka, the Germans ordered the Italians to attack the town of Petrikokka in a pincer movement. The Pasubio division would attack from the northeast and the Torino division from the southeast. On the morning of September 28, 1941, the Torino division attacked Soviet forces. The Soviet forces fought fiercely, and the Torino division had to push through a Soviet minefield. However, the Torino division eventually broke through Soviet lines. On the following day, both the Torino and the Pasubio divisions were ordered to continue their advance towards Petrikokka. The 2 divisions were ordered to complete the pincer movement and cut off the Soviet retreat. At the same time, the Duca d'Aosta division would send 2 battalions to start to eliminate the remaining Soviet soldiers trapped in the town of Petrikokka. Total Italian casualties numbered 291 men, of whom 87 were killed, 190 were wounded, and 14 were missing. About 10,000 Soviet prisoners were captured, with an unspecified number of Soviet soldiers being killed. The town of Petrikokka was successfully taken, and large amounts of weapons were captured. As winter approached, the invasion forces began consolidating their occupation zone and building defensive works. The Soviet forces counterattacked on Christmas Day of 1941, and the CSIR managed to hold out long enough for the Germans to provide backup. Together, the Italians and Germans defeated the Soviet offensive by the 28th of December. In total, the Christmas battle, as this battle would come to be known, cost the Italians 168 dead, 715 wounded, and 207 missing. The Italians had fought a larger Soviet force, but emerged victorious. The Soviets suffered over 2,000 dead, with the Italians taking 1,200 prisoners. Due to the successes of the CSIR, Mussolini would increase the number of Italian troops fighting in the USSR in July of 1942. The Italian 8th Army would be formed, combining the CSIR with new units. 7 new Italian divisions arrived on the front lines, combining with the 3 CSIR units, for a total of 10 Italian divisions fighting in the USSR. Italian forces in Russia would soon total 229,000 men, with 22,000 vehicles and 1,340 artillery pieces. General Messi, commander of the CSIR, opposed Mussolini's decision to send more troops to the Eastern Front. Messi believed that the supplies that were being provided were not enough for his 65,000 men, let alone the 229,000 that Mussolini planned to send. Although the CSIR fought valiantly and won many victories, they were severely hindered by poor logistics. Few supplies reached the CSIR units stationed on the front lines. The onset of winter caused Italian gear to break down, with everything from machine guns to vehicles being rendered useless. Italian troops, similar to their German counterparts, were not supplied with proper winter gear, and frostbite took many soldiers out of action. Lastly, the Italian weapons proved to be incredibly ineffective at countering Soviet armor. Italian tanks were completely useless against Russian T-34s. The Italian infantry did not have any effective anti-tank weapons and were forced to use Polish anti-tank rifles, which were also ineffective. After expressing his concerns, Messi was promptly fired and replaced. The Italian army in Russia, or Armir, advanced toward the bank of the Don River in July of 1942. After initial victories, the Armir soon began to take heavy casualties. On August 12th, 30,000 Soviet troops and several tanks crossed the Don River to launch a counterattack on the Italian sector. The Soviets took the 2nd Infantry Division by surprise and, with no tanks at its disposal and outnumbered 4-1, the 2nd Division was routed in 2 days. It subsequently withdrew to Yagodny, which was attacked by the Soviets on August 20th. From August 20th to August 24th, the remnants of the division beat back several Soviet attacks. Reinforcements arrived on August 24th and defeated the Soviets. This was known as the First Defensive Battle of the Don, which resulted in the following Italian losses: 900 killed, 4,200 wounded, and 1,700 missing or captured. On August 24th, the Italian cavalry regiment that was sent to the Eastern Front would surprisingly see action. Italian troops were being overwhelmed by a renewed Soviet counteroffensive, and the obsolete cavalry regiments were brought to the front lines to try and stop the Soviet advance. The cavalry troopers were being fired upon by Soviet machine guns and mortars and had to move quickly. The cavalry troopers decided to charge the Soviet lines, which was a particularly dangerous decision as the Soviets were in fortified positions. Not only did the Soviets hold a superior position, but they also had superior numbers. 2,500 Soviet troops faced off against a mere 700 Italian cavalry soldiers. As the Italian soldiers charged, they began to take heavy casualties, with several troopers and horses being gunned down by machine gun fire. However, the Italians continued their charge. As they neared Soviet trenches, the Italians tossed hand grenades towards the Soviets. Some cavalry troopers dismounted and began slashing their way through Soviet soldiers. Ultimately, the cavalry charge turned out to be a success. In total, 150 Soviet soldiers were killed, with 300 being wounded and 600 being captured. Only 32 Italians were killed, along with dozens of horses. Overall, the battle was a minor event on the Eastern Front, but the cavalry charge had great propaganda value on the Italian home front. This is generally considered to be one of the last successful cavalry charges in history. This cavalry charge was one of the last true victories the Italians would win against the USSR. German defeat at Stalingrad in February of 1943 signaled a shifting tide on the Eastern Front. Slowly, Axis forces began to be pushed out of the USSR. All Italian troops were called back to Italy to regroup and re-equip a month after Stalingrad in March of 1943. The plan was to send these troops back to the USSR, but this would never happen. Mussolini was taken out of power in July of 1943, and Allied troops would begin their invasion of Italy in September. The Italian army soon crumbled, with the German army left to continue the fight against the Allied troops. In total, 30,000 Italians died fighting on the Eastern Front, and another 54,000 would die in Soviet captivity. The Italian forces in Russia had been reduced to less than 150,000 men, and 34,000 of those men were wounded. And that's the forgotten story of the Italian military's role in Operation Barbarossa. Despite other military failures during the Second World War, the Italians who fought against the USSR proved to be an effective fighting force. The Italians' ultimate downfall in the East did not come due to their fighting ability, but rather due to logistical issues. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking or subscribing.